So you're probably already a good listener. So we want you to learn how to listen therapeutically. Okay, how do you do that? We're going to cover 6 topics now in the next little while about how to listen therapeutically, in particular, how to be a good listener. And we're going to get some advice about the difference between sympathy and empathy from a woman named Brené Brown. And here that comes now.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Brené Brown just said, sympathy drives disconnection, empathy fuels connection. Does that sound right to you? The difference between sympathy and empathy? We have sympathy for all sorts of people, but it typically is an arm's length interaction. That poor son of a gun, you know. There was a couple of terrible incidents here in the Twin Cities in the last day or so involving children. And we think that's just awful. What in the world would drive somebody to do those things, to hurt kids? Yet it's not our kids, and we don't know those people. We probably don't know the people, the victims. And so you can sympathize with that, but our sympathy doesn't do them much good. Empathy, on the other hand, as I think Brown just tried to illustrate, does people a whole lot of good. You can, in fact, walk with them, and they know that you're walking with them through this terrible time. So I assume that there were people in regard to these losses that occurred in our town in the last couple of days who were, in fact, walking with these people and will somehow stay with them for the long, long time ahead that it's going to take to recover. Alignment. Remember we've talked about this now some in our time together. I think we talked about it on our very first day when you introduced each other, things that you might have had in common. So alignment means connecting on an emotional or experiential level. It helps the people trust you because you have something in common. You're like them, they're like you. Alignment is why car salesmen ask about your kids and your sports teams. Did you watch the Final Four? What did you think? Were you happy with the outcome? They talk about the weather. We all talk about the weather because it affects all of us. So it's a way for us to relate to one another. A biblical version of it. You want to read it?
To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessing.
In theological parlance, this is called apologetics, where we bond with people in order to win them over. As it says here in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, I do it for the sake of the gospel so that we all might share in its blessings. That's alignment. It doesn't minimize shared losses. This is what Brown was talking about. Any sentence that starts with "at least" is probably not a very helpful sentence. At least you can have other children, at least you have other friends, and the implicit messages there is I can't have other kids, I don't have other friends. It's more about you than it is about them, and it doesn't rank shared experiences. My heart attack was worse than your heart attack.
It's a contest, I don't want to.
Who wants to win that? Or this one, the death of my child was worse than the death of your child. My lake cabin is bigger than your lake cabin, or my Jeep is better than your Jeep. I mention this because unless you own a Jeep, you wouldn't know that Jeep owners wave at each other. We all wave at each other. I have an old Jeep. It's almost 40 years old. And it doesn't matter if somebody has a brand new Rubicon that costs $60,000, or I have my, rusty old Jeep. We wave at each other, and we're just glad to say hello. We bond. We align.
My son just bought a Jeep, and he said that in the parking lots too, if there's a Jeep there and there's a spot by it, you're supposed to park together.
That's right. Yeah.
He said there's a whole list of
Yeah,
rules.
it's true for sports cars. I owned a sports car also when I was a little MG when I was in college, and I didn't know that. You don't know it till you get one, that people who own certain kinds of vehicles wave at each other. So Methodists don't wave at each other. We don't know who we are, right? But with a vehicle, it's a little easier. So it gives us a place to hang our hats in a way. Most people try to align in social situations because then they have something in common. And you can kind of be quick friends because of that thing. So we're going to do a quick exercise. I want you to turn to the person next to you. 1, 2, 1, 2. So it'll have to be 3 of you go in one little pod. Or I'll do Greg. I want you to take 3 minutes to find out what you have in common. 3 minutes. Come up with all the things that you can.
Oh, okay. Native. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't have to be all 3 of those comments.
Okay, let's pull ourselves back together, please. Back to the big group. So how about over here? How many things did you find that you had in common? 12?
Half of them, maybe.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9.
Great. And for example, what were some of them?
We're both Methodists. We both go to Coon Rapids United Methodist Church. We both were brought to church by neighbors as children, and that's how we discovered the Lord. We have losses that are similar in both of our families, and we both like to volunteer. We go to Bible study together. We both take care of disabled husbands, and we care a lot about others, and we have family members who suffered from alcoholism.
So some of those are not, they're just sort of coincidental. Others are more serious, caring for disabled husbands, for example. And thanks. How about back here? How did you folks do?
We had about 7.
And for example?
We both have been involved with Can-Do Canines. It's like assistant dogs. Both go to Sacred Journey. We're both Methodist and taking the care team training. We're both single women. We're both not native Minnesotans. We already have a mutual person that we've been caring for, and we both have different but similar interests in the Biwala project.
Yeah, and see, you found that out in just 3 minutes. Isn't that something? You didn't have to be driving a Jeep to do it. Yeah, that's great. So most people will find something that they have in common with anyone that they meet. If you talk for long enough, odds are you'll find something. And that will be true for your care receivers too. You'll go to visit them, and just through a natural process of chatting back and forth, you'll find out that you have things in common, more than that you're connected with the congregation that you're from. So that's what alignment does, and it helps you connect with them. That's why we do it. Reflecting emotion. That was one of Brene Brown's core principles. Something that we want to do is track the emotional reactions that people that we're visiting are having. And there's some ways of doing that. It gives words or cues to a mood or the cues that the speaker has expressed. They didn't say that they're sad, but you can just tell. Feelings, generally speaking, are derivations of these four: glad, sad, mad, and scared. You can see the little emoticons there that are indicators, what you see in people's faces when they're feeling those things. And you can get to these four primary feelings from almost any other emotional reaction.
I think it's easy, though, sometimes to misinterpret and even misread a face and maybe ask, are you sad, are you scared?
Yep, we're going to get to that in a minute. You're absolutely right, because we can make a mistake in reading an emotion. We might think it's sad when it's really anger. And that would be a big mistake to make. If your care receiver responds to a feeling question, something that you asked, either an open or closed-ended question, we'll talk about those in a minute, with a thought, so you're asking about a feeling, they respond with a thought, you might interpret what seems to be behind their thought statement. And here's a real-life care receiver, caregiver interaction. How did you feel when you heard you had a heart attack? I never thought that would happen to me. So that's a thought response. But here the caregiver interprets it. So you were surprised, and that might be a derivation of scared. Boy, was I. So it's confirmed. There's an actual conversation. So we interpret the things they're saying, give a name to them, and they can say yes or no. Just what we were saying a moment ago. You can say, were you surprised? And then it was confirmed, yeah.
Or you can say, tell me more.
Or tell me more, which is a good open-ended statement to make. There you go. Managing emotion. If a conversation with your care receiver goes too deep, and there is a tendency for this to occur, if they trust you and start speaking out of their heart of hearts, it can go to a place that is a little bit more serious than you feel comfortable managing and maybe they feel comfortable expressing. So a good way to move out of that is to ask left brain questions. And not everybody believes in left and right brain theory, but your left brain, at least according to this system, is where you balance your checkbook, and your right brain is where you play piano or sing. And your right brain is also where emotions tend to express themselves. So if you move from your left brain to your right brain, or you help people do that, you can sort of settle down the emotional reaction. And a great way to do this is a trick I learned from a psychologist just years and years ago, is work numbers. Just work numbers. I've got myself so trained in this, in fact, that I only need to use the first three numbers of my telephone number, my old Florida telephone number, to calm myself.
Oh, this is to calm you, not
Calm you or them. Calm you or them. So if it's you, you can do this internally. Some people say their social security number. They might do their address. If you're having a big emotional reaction, you might need to do math. Let's do your times tables. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 16, 64. And 64 times 64 is where most people get lost. So you might work numbers just in your head. If it's them, you might ask them a question that has a number answer. How old are you? What was your address back at the home the house where you used to live? Anything to do with numbers. Because if, for example, you're talking about their old house and they're getting a little melancholy and sad about it, and it feels like they don't want to be sad about it. And I should say right there that expressing emotion is the normal and right thing to do. But if for some reason you want to rein them or you in, this is a good way to get around it. I come from a very long line of weeping people, and so when I'm doing a funeral and I'm feeling a little sad, well, the thing is I've got to have it together, because I'm the guy that's standing up front. So I'll have to do this all the time. But with me, it works. So the next time you see a sad movie or something that makes you a little weepy, if you're one that's prone to becoming a little weepy, just do that. Do some math in your head, say your phone number, say your social security number, and see if it works for you. It doesn't work for everybody, but it does work for a lot of people. It is absolutely not wrong to be weepy. I think it shows that you give a darn. But you don't want to be more weepy than them. See, it's fine for you to both be sad, but you want to be a little bit more composed because you are the caregiver, the giver. And we don't want that role to get reversed. All right, we're going to have a little emotional reflection exercise. We're going to break into groups of 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So it's going to have to be a 3 and a 4. We can do a 3 and a 4. There's going to be a speaker, a listener, and either 1 or 2 observers. So depending on who ends up in a group of 4. So we want the speaker, and we're going to do this 3 times so you can take turns. You'll all have a chance to be a speaker. Talk about a pleasant subject. My favorite hobby, I like church, I'm proud of my kids, or anything else that is pleasant to you. Draw out the story, but use only questions that involve emotional reaction. So we're focused in this part of the presentation, we're talking about emotion, okay? So whoever it is that's the listener, use questions that draw out the speaker's emotional reaction to the thing that gives them pleasure. Got it?
Okay.
You think? Okay, it's fine. So just move off to a couple different sides so you're not on each other's earshot quite so much. First thing you have to do is... No. Okay. So first thing to do is decide who's going to be the storyteller, and then the second thing to do is who's going to be the listener, and then whoever is left is the observer.
I like to get a variety. I like to get ones that are different colors and different shapes. Last year I had some that were small, kind of teardrop shaped and yellow. So there's lots of different varieties out there. It's fun to try different ones other than just the standard red ones.
So what do you do with your tomatoes when you grow them all?
Eat them with lunches or meals. Give a few away to neighbors and trade sometimes.
Do you preserve them anyway?
No.
Oh, great. And so my God,
I did that with beans. I had a lot of beans one year, so I cooked them quick and froze them. I had pouches of beans in the freezer for a long time, which was nice because they're virtually free. There's a little energy involved in the cooking and the actual picking and time involved in picking. But effectively, I just paid for the seed packet and I got a lot of benefit out of it.
So what gives you joy?
The taste of the tomatoes.
Baking?
The taste of the tomatoes, and knowing that the beans or tomatoes were growing right in my yard.
Okay, that's probably good. Then we can switch. So I can't say that I really observed a whole lot of different things. You asked some good questions, and you looked, kind of excited about talking about it, a subject you like. So I think that went well.
Thinking about the emotional reactions our receivers are having to what's being said is important. You should have your antenna up about that. We don't always think about it, but you should try very hard to say what's going on underneath the surface. They might be quite open about it and tell you exactly how it is that they feel. And then others, you have to pull it out a little bit because you can misread it, and it's important to get it right. So that's why we do this exercise. So you want to always be thinking about what's going on just under the surface, and is what's on the surface, does that match? We'll talk about that in a moment when it comes to body language. 7 keys to effective listening. So here we go. We've talked about this. 7 things that you can remember to do that will help you have a good visit. You never get a second chance to make a first impression. That's absolutely true. So you want to get off on a good foot with these folks, and it will help you have a visit that starts, goes, and finishes well. So key number 1, you got to get the ball rolling. Ask a question to start the conversation. You might begin with a greeting, a hello. You might notice something in their room and comment on it, but it primes the pump. It gets them ready to start talking, and it's because you've initiated it. You've asked them for something. We have our go-to opening lines. We all do it. How's it going? How are you doing today? We'll talk a little bit about how to elicit a response that they decide on rather than one that we prompt in just a moment when we think about the word psychosomatic. So the first thing is to just get the conversation going somehow or another, usually with a question. There are a couple of different question types. We've talked about them here already. Closed-ended questions restrict the response options and can often be answered just with yes or no. The stems include did you, is this, do you, was it, were you. Easy to answer. They establish facts, they clarify. Oftentimes it's all you need to do to get the ball rolling. People will just take it from there. But if somebody doesn't respond too well to yes or no questions, you may need to ask a different kind of question. As it mentions here, did you have surgery? Yes. Were you frightened? No. Was anyone there to calm you? Yes. So that's a pretty short conversation. Now, odds are most people will run with those questions and start talking a little bit more. But for those that are more quiet and reserved, you might need to ask a different kind of question. And that, of course, would be an open-ended question. If closed-ended questions don't work, try an open-ended question. They don't restrict answers. What, when, where, how, why. They call for elaboration. They give the speaker some latitude to respond, encourage free and open communication, and typically can't be answered by one word. What happened with your surgery? How did it affect you? How were hospital staff or your friends able to calm you? Can you say some more about that? I'll often use that line. Tell me some more about that.
What if you get kind of stonewalled by the person and they obviously just don't want to talk about it?
Probably time to change subjects. Yeah, find something that they do want to talk about. If you're talking with them about, trying to talk with them about something and you're just getting nowhere, it may be a tree that's just not barking up, and you may need to go somewhere else. So you kind of go fishing for something that they are more interested in. Going to see a couple of tables that are summarized here. Closed-ended questions get information. Open-ended questions generate empathy. This is in your slide handout. Open-ended questions do all these things. They have advantages and disadvantages, each of them. I invite you just to look this table over. They both work. If you ask more than 3 questions about the same subject, you might be starting to do therapy with them. You're getting a little too deep, and that might call for a referral, particularly if you're observing a strong emotional reaction. You may open a can of worms that you're not equipped to respond to. Now, if you happen to be a licensed mental health therapist, maybe you can respond to it. But you have to decide how deep you're going to go with somebody. And over the years, we've just used this little advice, which is if you're asking more than 3 questions about the same subject, you might be getting a little too deep. This guideline we use with firefighters and police officers and emergency responders who are a little bit more time limited. So you might be able to talk more about a particular subject that someone is having deep feelings about than your average sheriff. One of the things we'll talk to you about in the reporting process is if there's something that's really urgent, you should use the phone and call. I mean, for example, if you're in a care facility, then you want to talk to nursing staff. If it's a shut-in from church, you might want to call the pastor on call. If it's a big emergency, call 911. If someone, for example, starts talking about suicide, well, you have to make an evaluation there if that's a real threat. And we can help you think through that. So you're not in this alone. If you need help looking after any of your care receivers, you can call us. And it'll either be your pastor from your congregation, hopefully have a way of getting a hold of them. That's true here. There's always a pastor on call, and usually I'm pretty available too. And even if you're from another church and you're stuck and you need to talk to somebody, it's fine to call me and I'll try and talk you through it. We'll talk about referrals next time too. Listen for areas of concern. Myron Madden was a pastoral care professor that I heard talk sometimes, and his sort of southern drawl way of talking about people is, what's making this critter tick? That's what he would say. He's a good old southern boy. It reminded me of Critter Country at Disney World. But Myron Madden was his name, and his little line, which he doesn't say out loud when he's going to visit somebody, he just says, what's making you tick? He doesn't do that, but he does it to himself, and I do too. Why is this person doing what they're doing? Why are they saying what they're saying? What makes them tick? So how do you identify an area of concern? And this is where using an opening question that doesn't lead them down any particular road, but lets them respond in a way that is most meaningful and important to them. So psychosomatic is a word that I've heard for a long time, and for at least the early part of my life, it was not a good thing. Sometimes my dad, who was a physician, or my mom, who was a nurse, would say this patient is just having psychosomatic troubles, like it's conjured up, it's manufactured. But then I went off to seminary and I learned that this word is produced by a couple of Greek words, one of which is psyche, which is translated mind, and another is soma. If a patient has generalized somatic complaints, where are they going on? All over their body, that's right, all over their body. And then interestingly enough, the word psyche is also translated soul or spirit. So this one word captures those three elements of a person's persona, what makes them up, their body, their mind, and their spirit. So you ask them an opening question, whatever it might be, and it's neutral, we hope, and then you listen which corner of the pyramid they respond from. I think one of our panel members in our first session together talked about that. Listening to the body, mind, spirit triangle, and when they say, "How you doing today?" they might respond by, "My hip hurts." They might respond by, "I'm sad. My kids haven't come to see me in a long time." They might say, "I'm feeling so beat up, I think God has just forgotten me." Mind, body, spirit. You ask a question in such a way that lets them go wherever they want to go, and then respond staying in that corner of the pyramid until it makes sense to leave it. So when somebody asks you, "How are you feeling today?" as people asked me when you came into the room today, and I had to decide which corner of the pyramid I was going to answer from. If I covered all three, I might answer differently than what I said to those of you who asked, or if I had answered from a different corner of the pyramid. So just listen, because where they answer from, the corner they answer from, typically, if they know you and trust you, will be their honest response, where they go first. So you need to take that seriously. And when it's run its course, you feel like you've probably talked enough, you might go on with, "What else have you been thinking about lately?" or "What else is going on?" Or they might move off the subject. But it's a good trick, and I've found over the years it works pretty good. You need to remember what they say, so you can follow up the next time you see them. There's a staff member here at church that I ask about her car, because I know she's been having car trouble. So that's a mind issue, and she's having trouble with her hip. That's a body issue, and I try to remember to ask her about those two things. It's flattering to the person who shared that information with you because you remembered. People like that when people remember what you tell them. So however it is that you make notes or remember things about the people that you see, carry that with you, and remember to bring it up the next time you see. So I need a volunteer. Somebody ask me about my sons. We're going to do an open-ended question exercise. Somebody asked me about my kids. Open-ended questions only. Somebody, anybody.
Tell me about your kids.
Well, there's Paul, Daniel, and Ben. Paul's the tall one. Daniel's the one with his hands out like this, and Ben is the youngest.
What are their ages?
18, 19, and 22.
What types of interests do they have?
See, so you're getting it, right? But this is, you have to work at that, don't you? Yeah, you have to work at that. What's the open-ended question? You certainly could ask me closed-ended questions. You might have asked about the dog, but or where were you when this picture was taken? All those kinds of things. And of course, they're much older now. But there is a way of asking open versus closed-ended questions, but you have to be intentional about it, and that's the point. So we're going to try that now, again, in our small groups. Whoever was the listener before, switch roles with the talker. We're going to add another element to it, and we're going to make this in difficult situations. So I'm not going to videotape you this time. You're just going to talk. You might choose, the speaker can choose any one of these things or something else. The worst part of my job, a recent stressful event, medical challenge for me or a loved one. The listener uses only open-ended questions to draw out the story, just as you did there. And if the listener uses a closed-end questions, then the speaker, whoever that is, should just answer with one word. So they'll know that they've asked a closed-ended question. We're going to do this exercise for 4 or 5 minutes. The observers is going to give feedback when it's over, and we're going to do it just once. So break back into your small groups, if you would. So how did that go, your time of talking in small groups? You were able to pull out the story? Great, that's the whole idea. It often will go quite smoothly. You don't have to be thinking about it quite so much. It's typically pretty natural. The flow of conversation with people who have a story to tell. But thinking about using open-ended questions to draw it out, and particularly helpful with teenagers. I certainly have learned this with my kids. If I ask them, was school okay today? I'll get a yes or no. So I don't do that anymore. I always say, tell me about what happened at school today. Then you get a story. So it's just a good habit. And then certainly reflecting emotion is helpful too. So we've only covered one key, and there's 6 more, but these we'll move through rather quickly. This is a body posture thing. When you're talking to people, sit forward. And by the way, sit. Sitting is good. It gives a whole different feel. If you sit when you're visiting, the same visit will feel longer than if you stand. So sit if you can and be on eye level with people and lean into them a little bit. Have a posture that shows that you're open and interested and that you're beginning to understand. Nodding is very helpful. Just like that. Or you can nod this way if something doesn't make sense. People just want to be understood, and a nod says that. Third, use your ears way more than your mouth. If people are having difficulty getting the story out, you might have to talk a little bit more. But I'm not sure if I've shared the story here with you, but I remember spending time with a family after a patient had died in the hospital where I worked, and they were hesitant to leave the room. Did I talk to you about that? They just didn't, the husband particularly didn't want to leave the room. And so the nurse called.
The dying patient.
Pardon me?
The room of the dying patient.
Room of the dying patient, of the now deceased patient. And I knew them. I'd known them for a long time. He worked at the hospital. He was a vice president. And they'd been married just forever. And the nurses were getting kind of worried because they needed to turn the room over, and it had been hours. So they called me, and I walked into the room. And there were the kids, and there was the husband sitting by the bedside holding her hand. And I said, Acton, when did you meet Ruth? And he talked for about 25 minutes, nonstop, the whole story of their life. It's all I ever needed to say, and all I needed to do was just nod. And at the end of that, he stopped talking. The story had run its course up to that day and that moment. And I said, you about ready to go home now? And he said, yeah, I am. So just getting the story going is the trick. And a well-placed question a single well-placed question will often be all you need to do. And then just listen, and don't worry about saying really brilliant stuff. The next closest thing to brilliance is silence. You should remember that. If what you're going to come up with isn't brilliant, you might try silence. Yeah. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, a mouth that closes and ears that don't. All physiological signs that maybe we're meant to listen a little more than we talk. Next, use your eyes when people are talking to you because it shows you're paying attention. You know, you're not looking over here, you're not looking down at your phone. I know we're from the Midwest and we tend to look at our feet when we talk instead of at our eyes. If you're uncomfortable looking at people in the eye, just look them in the forehead. They'll think you're looking them in the eye, but then it won't unnerve you and you can stay concentrated and focused. And paying attention is really important. Grunt and groans. What are the grunts and groans of listening? Do them. Mm-hmm. You don't have to agree. It doesn't have to be It can just be Our oldest son once asked my wife, why does Dad say all the time? Well, I'm just trying to pull the story out, and it acknowledges that I've heard what's been said, and I want the people to say more, the person to say more. Number 6, remember, people will just love you forever. That's why I mentioned earlier, how's it going with your car? How's it going with your achy hip? People will love it that you remember. When you go to the doctor's office and for a checkup and they ask you about things that you discussed at their last visit, it's because the doctor probably wrote that stuff down, and before he or she came into the office, they looked at their notes and remembered what it was that you discussed, and so they can ask about that. So however it is that you keep track of things, make sure that you do remember. And then 7th, listen with what we call your third ear for what's not being said. The things that are a little bit under the surface. What's their body language telling you? We're going to talk about that in just a moment. So those are the 7 keys to listening, really just simple as can be. Ask questions, lean forward, nod, use your ears more than your mouth. Look at people, grunt and groan occasionally, remember the story, and use your third ear. You're going to have homework this week to do that with a family member or a friend, using those 7 keys, and see how it affects the conversation, both for you and for them.
To tell them we're doing it, or
No,
just,
just do it. Just sneak up on them. All right. Nonverbal attending and silence. Talked a little bit about body language. That's what this is. You probably all heard of it. Posture, body orientation, focus of attention, mood, gestures, touch, clothing, listening environment, tone of voice, pitch, pace. Nate talked about some of those things a little bit. You can't tell what a person's tone of voice is when they're emailing you, but you certainly can tell it when you're with them. We're going to look at a table in a moment about this. So everybody sit as if you're completely disinterested in what I have to say. See, so you see, and if you were actually doing that, I'd think, oh my gosh, I'm doing a terrible job here. I want you to pay attention to me. I want you to be engaged. So we know this, don't we, when somebody's not too interested in what we're talking about, and when that happens, we need to change course. So here's a little bit about nonverbal attending, the action and the message it sends. Choose a quiet space. So that's important to do if you're visiting somebody in a nursing home lobby, for example, or the dining room. That might occur from time to time. There's all kinds of commotion going on. It's not conducive to personal sharing. So try to find a quiet place. Dress comfortably. I usually say business casual, like you are today. If you come in wearing a suit and a tie or a tux, that sends a kind of a message, don't you? And if you come in wearing cutoffs and a saggy old T-shirt, that sends another kind of a message. So try to dress in a way that won't either suggest that you're not taking the visit very seriously or you're too busy and important to listen. Comfortable clothing. Maintain an open posture. So if somebody's talking to you or you're talking to them and you're sitting with your legs crossed, your arms folded like this, that is not an open posture. It's what you did just a moment ago when I asked you to act disinterested. So try and sit, lean forward, arms open, not crossed, legs uncrossed. Lean forward. It shows that you're interested. Nod, I mentioned that. It shows that you understand. Make those neutral sounds like, I want you to say more. Relax and be a non-anxious presence. And that's really the thing, is to just be non-anxious. People have enough anxiety in their life without you bringing more in. So just be calm, be soothing. I used to be a fire rescue chaplain in St. Petersburg, Florida, and there was a paramedic whose name was Arthur Pillig. And I liked running with him. He was on Rescue 1 in St. Pete, Florida. And he had such a calm, soothing way of interacting with accident victims or somebody to whose house we'd been sent. My job was to look after family so they didn't get in the way of whatever the paramedics were trying to do. And he could calm people down in the most chaotic of situations. There could be a fire just in the other room, and he would soothe and talk. We're going to move you out of here now. I'm going to take a step by step by step. It wasn't wild talk. It wasn't loud talk. It was very calm and soothing. One of the vice presidents of the hospital where I worked would always start a meeting with the managers, of which there were 50 or 60. Loud bunch of people are always talking. He would just start talking like this as the meeting got going. We're going to begin our agenda now. And people just knew it was time to be quiet. It's time to be still. Happens in church too sometimes, right? They might gong a gong and well, that's the time to be quiet. Or someone might just talk. Be non-anxious as much as you can. We're going to get you through this. So here's a little pyramid. I invite you just to look at this, not so much now, but you can think about it later. Positive and negative, open and closed. Body language and the message that it sends. So if you've got a wobbly voice like this, like Katharine Hepburn, it's a little hard to focus. So you might want to slow down a smidge. You don't want to be seen as aggressive or attacking. You don't want to do that. And this isn't likely to happen in your care receiver visit. It's more likely to happen at home when you interact with the people there with whom we do sometimes have intense interactions. But try to stay on the positive side. Smile, be open, be interested. Moderate eye contact. Just don't drill them with your eyes all the time, because that might make people uncomfortable. They'll let you know probably by how much they look at you. Make sure your voice is loud enough so you can be heard. Hearing is a problem for some people, so you got to check that out. You might need to talk louder, because if you don't, they can't hear you. And make sure your arms and your hands support what's being said. If nonverbal and verbal messages conflict, you probably ought to trust the nonverbal one. I'm really glad to be here today. Maybe not so much, see? So listen to the tone of voice, look at what their body is telling you, and decide if you're going to check that out or not, or just kind of put it on a back burner and make note of it. Silence, another important tool. I will whisper secrets in your ear. Just nod and say yes. Just nod yes and be silent. Silence is just fine. It's a purposeful choice to give someone time and space they need to say what they need to say, think what they need to think. It encourages the person to talk, reflect, and lets the person fill the void with what's on their mind. So I don't know what is a comfortable amount of silence for you. If you ever want to try that and see how it feels, just wait a minute when you're with people with whom you're talking, and don't say anything. And if they don't say anything either, just see if it gets a little uncomfortable for you. But a minute wouldn't necessarily be too long, particularly if you can tell that the person you're visiting is reflecting on what's been said up to that point. So let them break the silence, and then once again see which corner of the pyramid they respond from, body, mind, or spirit, and let them go where they want to go. If the silence seems to be getting a little too long, you might just say something like, I'm wondering what you're thinking. And they might say, I'm thinking you're never going to ask me another question. We're going to be here forever if you don't start talking. So, but most of the time people are in fact reflecting on what's been said. That's oftentimes when there's silence after the sermon, right? In a lot of churches they do that. They'll have a minute or so of just quiet time after the preacher sits down, because you're digesting what's been said. It's a good way to use time. All right, how do we get out of the room? If this really works so well and people will start talking and talking and talking, how do you end the visit? And that came up, I remember, with the panel in our first session, that how long might a visit go? Well, they said it might go for 2 hours, longer if you let it. And that might be too long for you, it might be too long for them. So how do we get out of the room? It's not all that hard. There are some things that you can do that are corollaries of those things we've talked about earlier. Stop asking questions. Stop moving into new material. You might want to stand. If I'm visiting with you, whatever the setting is, and I stand up, that sends a nonverbal message that something's about to happen. Namely, I'm leaving. Continue your eye contact and listening, but don't nod quite so much maybe, and don't lean in quite so much. Lean back as if you're beginning to withdraw. Stop your grunting and groaning. You might talk about a future visit. I hope to see you again. How would next week be, or next month? And then finally say this, I have to go now. In all my years of doing this, I've never had anybody challenge me on that. What I would encourage you not to do is say, I have to go now to pick up my kids, or I have to go now because I'm going to a movie with a friend, or I have to go now because my car needs its oil changed. Because the message that sends is all those things are more important than you. So just keep it at this. It's time for me to go now. And you'll find, I believe, most people will be accepting of that. So here's what we've considered. Sympathy versus empathy, alignment, reflecting emotion, the 7 keys, question types, psychosomatic, body, mind, spirit, nonverbal attending, silence, and ending the visit. So we're going to have one more breakout group where we're going to invite you to do this exercise one last time. Again, might be a difficult subject, might be a pleasant subject. You decide. We want to use all these techniques. Reflect emotion, use open-end questions, and the 7 keys to draw out the story. It's your last interaction of the day. So if you haven't been a listener or haven't been a speaker yet, try to do that in your next group. So get in a group where you can be that. And you might need to switch groups to pull this off. Okay? Last thing to do, we'll take about 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll wrap up. Ready, set, go. All of this will come naturally for you after a while. It might seem a little scripted now as you're trying to remember, oh, what was the 5th key? But honestly, if you just lean forward, nod, ask a few open-ended questions, and reflect what you're hearing right back to them, the conversation will flow very nicely, to the point that you may have to do some of those techniques I mentioned about bringing it to a close, that there are time limits. You can also do that at the beginning of a visit. If you've ever been to a therapist, they always say, well, we have 50 minutes, an hour lasts 50 minutes. So, and they almost always have a clock on the wall. So you might want to say, I have an hour to spend with you today. And then, we have about 10 minutes left. And most therapists will tell you that people do their most intense work in the last 10 minutes of a visit because they know time is running out. So those are all ways to manage time. If on the other hand you've got all the time in the world, then you have to measure their energy level, and then maybe, even though you'd like the visit to go on, it might not be best for them. And all of that is really tailored to the person that you're seeing. The next thing we're going to try to do was go over the anatomy of the visit talk, but as I expected might happen, we've run out of time today. So I'm going to turn that into homework. I would invite you to look at that. It's the back of tab 3, I think, in your notebook. We've covered a lot of that material, but in particular, the first section about preparing for the visit is important. So if you'd look that over. The visit begins not when you walk in to the patient's room or home. It begins way before that, and it will explain that to you there, the things that you need to do up front. So look at that, and we'll talk about it next week. I know I gave you this now on handout last week, but actually it's supposed to be in today's lecture, so that's why it was under tab 3. The last little line I think is nice. Healing is the humble but also very demanding task of creating and offering a friendly, empty space where strangers can reflect on their pain and suffering without fear and find the confidence that makes them look for new ways right in the center of their confusion. So creating an empty space somewhere within you, somewhere where people can put their stories and they trust you and are willing to turn that story over to you so they don't have to carry it by themselves any longer. All right, homework for next week. I have 1 minute to tell you about it. Shadowing continues. If you haven't signed up for some shadowing experiences, please call those caregivers and let them know you'd like to do that. Send a supportive email, text message, tweet, Facebook post to somebody, a troubled family member or friend, using the techniques that Nate talked about today. And see if you get a response. I'll be asking you about that next time. Did somebody respond to you either that they appreciated it or it wasn't so good? But give it a go and see how it works. You might want to start that disclosure and authorization document. We'll talk about that some more next week. That's the background check. Devotions in case you're asked, and then I've just added read the anatomy of the visit, which is not in your notebook, but it's now there. So we have to cover that material before we run out of time. And I think we'll have time next week. Any last questions? We didn't cover it today. We covered it in part. There are a number of, when you read the anatomy of the visit, you'll see that there's a lot of things that we covered. But
We won't meeting next week, correct?
oh, we are meeting next week, are we? Next week is the Saturday before Easter. So, yes, very important, very important. Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, so happy Easter, happy Holy Week, Palm Sunday. Hope you have a great day in church, both tomorrow and a week from tomorrow. And this will give you some time to do some of your shadowing. Okay? Thank you. Have a blessed Holy Week and a good Easter, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.